Okay, does everyone feel able to do that? You click the little kind of 3 little dots next to your name, and you've got an option there to rename. Good, everyone seems to be getting the hang of that. Very helpful. Just a couple of little bits of housekeeping to begin with. So I will be recording this session for the benefit of those who aren't able to attend, and so that the debate and conversations we have remain as a resource for people that are part of the Driver Arts Driver project. If that is a problem at all for you, do let me know in terms of if there's something you've said that you think is a problem in terms of sharing. Let me know straight away after the event, and we can see what we can do to take that out. But otherwise I'm taking kind of general consent. There's no fire drills planned, so if an alarm goes off, that means your house is on fire. So please deal with that rather than continue with the call. That's what I recommend. And obviously the toilets are on the left. I've muted everybody for now. Reason being that we can get lots of background noise and so on. There'll be plenty of opportunity for you all to have a chance to feed into the dialogue and conversation. My colleagues Kate and Ushi, if you can wave, Kate and Ushi. They're also here, so they will help me to identify who wants to speak. So if you do want to take part in the conversation, either just raise your hand like this and wave it for a bit, or use the little button down at the bottom that says reactions, and you can put a thumbs up, or you can do a sort of clapping symbol, but just indicate that you're keen to say something. There's a few of you, so I've got to keep kind of flicking between screens, but between the three of us, we should be able to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple of introductions in a second to the Driver Arts Driver program and to our 3 lightning speakers, which I'm really delighted that we've got 3 really interesting experts on the panel today who are going to talk a little bit about their experiences of using data or discovering the limits or possibilities of data during this crazy period. But their role is to open out conversation and to stimulate and provoke you all into putting forward your own thoughts as well. Okay, we've still got some people arriving. You've got the chat box there as well. So if you want to kind of raise a point or add a question or a comment, but don't necessarily want to speak it out loud, then please do add it to the chat bar there. We will kind of download a copy of that and make sure that's circulated with the video as well. I think we've got everybody in now, 22 participants. This is great. So for those of you who haven't had a role yet within the Driver Arts Driver program, I think some of you have. It's been great to see you at the physical events. We can remember what they were like and what it was like to be in a room with other people that you're not related to. I'm not sure I can remember that. Then, welcome back. And for those of you who are new, it's a delight to see you. So the Driver Arts Driver project is attempting to, as we put on the screen here, spark a superfusion of creativity, technology, and business. And this is using concepts around big data, particularly data from Gatwick Airport, as a stimulus for innovation, with creativity and technology at the heart, working together in collaboration. So this event, like all the events for businesses, entrepreneurs, creative enterprises, part of the University of Brighton's wider Driver Arts Driver project. So now you are part of this. You can join the member community for exclusive and free access to data innovation resources, opportunities, more events, and including access to Gatwick Airport's live data stream, plus funding and cash awards. So all of that is available at driverartsdriver.com, which hopefully you will all have to have had a potter around in order to be able to access this event. If you manage to slip through the net, then do please make sure you go back to that site and have a look. There's some really interesting resources there. And because it was a digital first project anyway, being able to continue in these tricky times, actually it was slightly ahead of the curve compared to some others that we're involved with. So lots and lots of there to explore. Okay, so I'm going to introduce now our first lightning talk. And I should mention, obviously, down the bottom there, you can see who's funding this, so no cost to you. You are here because of the funding and capacity from the ERDF, European Regional Development Fund, and Arts Council in England, so thank you very much to them. So our first lightning talk is from Dr. Sam Knowles. He's the Managing Director of Insight Agents. He has been a part of the DRIVA project on a couple of events in the past, which has been we're really grateful for. There's not much he doesn't know about data as a storytelling tool, and he's got a new book out in a couple of weeks as well, which I'm sure he'll tell you about. But I'd like to welcome Sam to deliver our kind of first provocation. Sam, hello, how are you?
I'm all right, and thank you for unmuting me. And hello, everybody. This is very exciting. So, I mean, some provocation. So, looking for diamonds in the dirt, I think, is one thing I've been encouraging those that I work with to do over the course of the last 8 weeks, because this is day 1 of week 8. Diamonds in the dirt. I mean, there's quite a lot of dirt, but the diamonds in the dirt, I think it's very interesting that we haven't, contrary to some politicians and public commentators' prognostications, maybe particularly around the EU referendum, but since, we haven't had enough of experts. Actually, expertise is back in fashion, although expertise needs to be done in the right way. I mean, I have to say, there was a time during lockdown that I used to take solace from the 5 o'clock press conference. I didn't become addicted to it, but I took solace from it. I took particular solace from it when the progenitor of that phrase, "we've had enough of experts," with their acronyms, one Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Mr. Michael Gove, was asked questions which he could not answer, and he had to defer to the expert on his left and the expert on his right, the chief medical and the chief scientific officer. What I think about expertise, you know, we are all being required to, if you'll excuse my pun, to know our R's from our elbow. R is the crucial number. But the way that experts and expertise are coming back to the fore is not without its problems. So I think one of the best public communicators of science in this country is Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter. Spiegelhalter runs the Winton Centre for Communicating Risk at the University of Cambridge, where he, as a mathematician, has a team of experimental psychologists that sit and work with him, and they look to communicate relative and absolute risk. He was known before coronavirus as Mr. Bacon Sandwich. He was the one person, whenever IARC, the International Association for Researching Cancer, would come out and say, you shouldn't be eating another bacon sandwich because it increases the risk by 20%, Spiegelhalter would come out and say, yeah, that's 5 people in 100 have a lifetime risk of contracting bowel cancer versus 6 people in 100. There's a difference between relative and absolute risk. And I think he's been very good and very, I mean, he's a member of SAGE, or he's attached to SAGE. He's been very good at doing 2 things. One is to talk about total death and total seasonal death and the rest of it. But he's also been very good at saying, hang on, government, you've used my data in the wrong way. You've misinterpreted this, you've willfully misinterpreted this, and this is a bad thing. So I think we haven't had enough of expertise, is my first point. The second point is, I think that we knew this already, but by and large, we are seeing data demonstrating that at times of crisis, the British public is actually quite obedient. And I think particularly that quite obedient number comes in tube and train traffic. Now, you might say that's self-interest, but that daily chart that Van Tam or Chief Scientific or Medical Officer will present, showing that train and tube traffic is 5% of what it was 8 weeks ago, is interesting. So I think there's an interesting use of data Spiegelhalter himself has said that, as I say, his data and some other data is being misused, and I've got absolute sympathy for that. The third observation I would make is that data can be used, and is often used, as the fuel for creating insight. I'm very interested in both data storytelling and insight, having written books on both subjects. But I think I contribute to a podcast called the Small Data Forum podcast, where we look at the uses and abuses of data, big and small, in politics, business, and public life. And our last 3 episodes have all been about coronavirus, inevitably. But there was an observation that one of my co-hosts raised the other day, is that on Etsy, the arts and crafts community, there are currently 50,000 sellers who have sold at least one face mask, and 500 sellers who have sold at least 10,000 face masks, and brands are going into this market. So what I think is interesting is, although many people have been unable to do anything that they used to do, either they're not essential retail, or they're not able to get to work, although who knows who's allowed to go to work after last night's announcement. But what is interesting is that we see data opening up a whole new area of innovation in arts and crafts, but also in terms of data analysis and data presentation. So my 3 things are: we haven't had enough of experts, that we are quite an obedient nation, and that data is showing us the way towards innovation that may take some people who've been removed from jobs that they can no longer do in the medium, even to long term, and maybe even ever. That data is shining a light, a diamond in the dirt, on where we might go in the future. Those are my 3 things.
Thank you, Sam. Very good opener with a bit of food for thought there. I'm going to throw these 3 provocations without any kind of big context around them to see kind of where we go from there. But I think that was a good bit of stimulus there. As a slight aside, I found out at the weekend that someone I went to school with and was pretty good friends with 25 years ago is David Spiegelhalter's daughter, and I had no idea. So now I feel very close to him, and hearing about his allotment. So who knows? Next time I'll get him on this the next presentation we do. Thank you. That was great. Right, I'm going to hand over now to Antonia. Antonia, calling. Can you?
Oh, hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. So my name is Antonia Forster. In a previous life, I was a behavioral scientist, and nowadays I work at a company called Ultraleap. And what we're very interested in is different ways of interacting with digital interfaces. So every so often in society, a revolution occurs in technology, and it redefines our view of normal. And those kinds of paradigm shifts are rare, but they have really long-lasting repercussions. So, for example, as long as personal computers have existed, keyboards have been the primary mode of input. They're based on typewriters, so you could say that the notion of a keyboard actually predates the notion of a computer. And the mouse was invented in the 1960s, although there were trackball type input devices that were used by the military in confidence before that. So keyboards and mice are still ubiquitous to this day, and in many instances, like when we're doing our kind of daily work and writing emails, they are the most appropriate input device. Touchscreens were then invented in the 1960s, and they entered public consciousness in the 1980s with things like Palm Pilots and their introduction to ATMs and fitness machines and checkout counters. But they didn't really explode into popularity until 2007. And that's when the very original first iPhone was released, which was one of the first ever mobile phones, not the first, but one of the first mobile phones with a capacitive touchscreen. The iPhone had a massive effect on technology and interfaces because it revolutionized the way we think about our devices. And that's largely because it redefined how we actually interact with them. Touchscreens are now commonplace in digital devices, not just our smartphones, but in the digital interfaces we use in public spaces outside of our home. That might be when we're buying train tickets, when we're topping up Oyster cards, withdrawing money from an ATM, buying cinema tickets, using the self-checkout counter in a supermarket, ordering fast food, searching for information at a kiosk, checking in at the airport or the GP, or even choosing a floor in an elevator. Buttons and screens like that are used by thousands of people every day. and they are likely to contain a high number of bacteria and viruses. Hospital information kiosks, for example, are a well-known source of infection, and fast food screens are also notorious. There was a study by London Metropolitan University, and it made headlines in 2018 because it found that touchscreens in a popular fast food chain, I won't name, but you can go Google it, were covered in substantial amounts of gut and fecal bacteria, including those that cause infectious diseases like Staphylococcus and Enterococcus faecalis. In our current climate, of course, we're more hyper aware than ever about what we touch in public spaces. The COVID-19 coronavirus is the first thing on all of our minds. So right now, and likely for a long period in the future, we're going to be more aware of hygiene. So how can we use digital interfaces in public spaces without touching them? That's specifically one of the problems that I'm trying to solve. So at Ultraleap, we use hand tracking and haptics to create the sensation of virtual objects in midair, which means that you can not only press buttons in midair, but you can actually feel them, even though you're not making any physical contact with the surface or screen. Now, usually I like to demonstrate in person. I can't demonstrate the haptic sensation or feeling without being there in person, but I did film a video for you to show you what touchless that's actually a very exclusive look at something I finished literally last night, and I filmed it myself in my spare room. It's my hand in the video, so my company hasn't actually seen that video yet. So it's a very, very exclusive peek. But you can see that I'm able to use a touchscreen without making any physical contact, and of course that completely eliminates the risk of picking up an infectious disease from the surface, which is not only useful in a post-pandemic world, but more broadly for public health beyond the coronavirus. And one of the most amazing things to me is that that screen isn't special in any way. In fact, that's my normal computer monitor. It's not actually a touch screen at all. But if I did use a touch screen, it's very easy to make it accept both touch and touchless input. It just has a small camera and a haptic array underneath. So it's impossible to predict what the next paradigm shift in technology will look like. And it's very hard to gather data to make that prediction. In fact, studies that have data on behavior change, which is something I'm very interested in, suggest that it's incredibly hard to get the general population to change their behavior. It takes a world-changing event. But it just so turns out we're going through a world-changing event right now, and we are learning to adapt. So I think this could redefine how we think about interaction, and I actually think it could be ubiquitous technology in the next few years. I'm very honored to be able to share it with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonia. Real privilege for us to have access to your development there, and I know it's been something that you've been accelerating in terms of that development. So yeah, really, really great food for thought there. So we've heard from Sam about the role of experts. We've heard from Antonia about the way that data is changing, or how we're using data to rapidly transform technological responses to this. So thirdly, I'm going to introduce now Paul Brewer. Paul is Director of Digital and Resources at Worthing and Ada Councils, and has been using data in some extraordinary ways and very quickly in terms of the kind of community organising response, but he's going to tell you a little bit more about that. Paul.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so my role at Ada and Worthing Councils is, as Richard says, focused around digital, but we also use quite a lot of service design, and our teams have over the years got quite good at understanding rapid design and agile development. And I think I didn't know they were coming on, but it's brilliant to see them here. James, the two Jameses are part of our digital team who have been central to our response. So the councils run all sorts of different services, from collecting the bins to approving planning applications to looking after the coastline and the parks. And we have a communities and wellbeing team who do a range of things to support the community, for example, on digital inclusion, providing advice and support across a range of things, working in tandem with the community and voluntary sector. And when the crisis hit, we needed to understand how to manage the response between those folk that were already self-organizing and joining mutual aid groups and providing support to their neighbours on the one hand, and a huge number of vulnerable people who were in need. Obviously, groups of people who wouldn't normally be on the council's radar. Excuse me. On the council's radar, because they now needed, they were self-isolating and they needed help with shopping and collection of medicines and things. So we took a couple of days to think about, sorry for all the kids going on in the background as well, to think about whether the council should play a really active role or whether or not the mutual aid groups and the volunteering in communities was sufficient. And we took an early call to think, actually that organisation may be strong in some areas and weak in other areas. It may decline over time after the first few weeks. This may carry on for some time. So we very quickly decided to use our platform thinking and our actual technology platform, which we use a rapid application development platform, a low-code platform, to design and build very quickly with a series of video calls with frontline practitioners, building as we went, building a request for support and a volunteer registration process, which fed into a platform where we could manage and match need with support. So I'm going to share screen and just give you a sense of what we built. Oh, I can't share screen. Can I share screen, Richard?
Yes, you should be able to, but have you got the green button at the bottom?
Yeah, it's not. It's because you're already sharing, I think.
Okay. Okay, it's not letting me give you the option to do it, I'm afraid.
Don't worry. So we've ended up with a pipeline essentially of people asking for help, and we have an online process for them to register their needs, and a pipeline of volunteers who we've done some due diligence around, kind of getting their passports, their DBS checks and all the rest of it. So we have two groups of people and we're able to match them, and we match them as closely as we can by where they live. So we have a fantastic, something which I get excited by, which is really simple data, but we are able to see, and the folk that are doing the matching are able to see a volunteer living very close to somebody who needs help. Now, of course, that can happen and is happening naturally in communities with WhatsApp groups and so on. But you'd be surprised with how many cases we've come across where that connection hasn't been made, and it might be, as I said at the beginning, really strong in some neighborhoods and absent in others. So being able to see who is able to help who. Literally, we've had people living next door to each other as pins on the map that humans have been able to spot and make the connection between people, with connections which hopefully will persist over time. So we've been able to use the insight from knowing what people need, whether they need help with prescriptions, shopping, and more complex needs. We have an ongoing view of that, and so now we're looking at how do we start to mainstream this understanding of the assets and the informal capacity in neighborhoods. How do we understand the range of people who have needs, and how do we work with communities and neighborhoods to make that kind of system and that connectivity between the informal, the formal and the statutory sectors persist over time in a very flexible way, which is goes with the grain of what those neighbourhoods are currently doing, and understanding what kind of support the council can provide, not just in the crisis but ongoing. So we've acted as a platform, a kind of an Airbnb for providing support in hyperlocal communities, and I think that's an interesting role for the council going forward. And that'll do.
Thank you, Paul. Fantastic. Sorry, I figured out halfway through you talking how I could let you share. So you can, if you had anything visuals to show, I'll give you an extra kind of minute or so. So if you wanted to do that.
I mean, it's just a map, but I will just show you what we are able to see, which is in red, that's people who need help, and in blue, that's people who have offered to help. So we're using that actively to match people together. Really simple stuff, but actually quite compelling when you know that there are real people on the end of those dots.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much to our three provocateurs there. So we've heard the kind of broader thinking around kind of policy and science expertise and decision making. We've looked at it with the real world example of some tech that's responded rapidly from a kind of commercial angle, but then also looking at how communities and the kind of private, public and voluntary sector can collaborate using data in order to scale up innovation at speed. So now really it's over to you. We've got our three experts who I'm sure will be happy to draw on some of their points in more detail if you had some questions for them. But I do want to open this out now to the floor really for people, whether you've got a question or whether you've got something that you'd like to add as a sort of contributor point. I'm going to, you need to wave your hand or give a little symbol or put a question in the chat bar, and we'll give you access to the microphone. Question there from Ushi to begin with, to Paul. Did you set this up quickly before the National NHS Volunteer Drive happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very long story, but essentially we didn't pay too much attention to what was happening nationally and realized that we needed a local response. It turns out that the volunteering that's been activated in neighbourhoods just naturally and through our local system has been where volunteers have been able to help, and the NHS volunteering scheme, as far as we know, hasn't really got off the ground. So not a surprise if you have 750,000 people to try and orchestrate from the centre. It doesn't really work. So yeah, we just kind of ignored it and cracked on.
And there's quite a lot of debate about the central versus local response, looking at the tracking and tracing app as well, isn't there? The monitoring of symptoms and so on. And they've gone with the centralised government-led operation rather than the more localised one. Is that something that's come up in conversations at local authority level, Paul?
I think it'll be the next sort of chapter, I guess, and we need to see, in this case, we need to see how the app is going to work and how that manual tracing is going to work. We don't want to go too early with something like that, but and indeed whether local government officers are going to have an active boots on the ground role. What has tended to play out is that a central scheme has been proposed, has sort of butted up against reality, and then local government have either stepped in or has already kind of worked out how to do it another way. So, for example, on food provision, we set up a food depot separate to the national distribution of food parcels. I mean, one of the things in this crisis was that, and it's a data-related point, is that there was quite a high level of obsession about the extremely vulnerable group, those with certain medical conditions, kind of ignoring the fact that there was a much larger population likely to emerge of people who were vulnerable by virtue of just, many other vulnerabilities, but also just being stuck at home and not able to get a delivery slot. So whilst everyone was obsessing about a relatively small, no doubt extremely vulnerable group, there was a whole kind of much larger population of the vulnerable to be worrying about and thinking about, and that kind of got lost as and the food provision to that much larger vulnerable group also got lost in the headlines of dealing with the extremely vulnerable group. So yeah, the lesson is, we'd already learnt it some years ago, I think, is local government just needs to take its own control, take its own path, and then adapt as and when anything from the centre turns up that's useful.
Thank you. So the question I'd like people to have a think about is, how can data be used to innovate solutions quickly? Well, we've heard a couple of examples of where that's happened, but maybe unpicking that a little bit. Often the challenges posed around being able to innovate quickly and to use data at scale are the security risks, and also the kind of privacy risks. I wondered if anybody had any thoughts around whether our attitudes towards sharing data is being challenged, or perhaps fears are being vindicated during this time when data seems to be at the forefront of how we're innovating. Antonia, did you have any, in terms of the commercial angle, obviously you're developing something that will be based on human, well, you talked about human behavior and understand having all we needed was a big crisis in order to be able to look at how humans behave, and voila, you've got one. What are the ethics of that in terms of your commercial development of your work?
It's interesting. I mean, there's a few different ones. So in terms of how we install the hardware, it's a camera. So there's some data security in terms of how we process images. However, it's just data of a hand. It doesn't capture features. It doesn't capture skin color. It doesn't capture like tattoos or like scars. It only captures positions, because that's how touchless touchscreens work. Is they determine your finger position, and they have a virtual interface that once you pass a certain position, then they're able to respond to that. So we've had a lot of discussion around data security, but in terms of what we're capturing, it's not any too sensitive, and also it's disposed of as soon as basically the interface captures it responds to your instruction. So it's not too much of an issue from our end. What we have found, which is really interesting, is that we're getting a lot more data now on behavior change. So I've had a lot of different careers in the past, and one of my previous roles was working in behavior change in a zoo, and it was to do with getting people to engage in more pro-environmental behaviors. And it's very difficult to change people's behavior if people are involved in certain daily, especially when the thing that they're trying to change or solve is a very long-term issue. So we know climate change is an issue we've known for a very long time. It's very much in public consciousness. People do know what it is. Not everyone believes it, but the data is undeniable that it's happening, and it's the result of humans. But getting people to change their daily behaviors is a great challenge, because the issue has such a long delay phase. The thing with coronavirus and COVID is that there's no long delay phase. It's something that is impacting us so in such a short time frame, and our lives have transformed so dramatically that people in a way we've never seen before, in an unprecedented way, are completely changing their behavior. So we're now seeing a lot more data in terms of people are responding to behavior change campaigns, especially in terms of hygiene-based behaviors, in a way that they wouldn't have before. So I'm confident that actually people will be able to adopt new technologies, especially now that hygiene is at the forefront of their mind. It makes it easier for us to have more data to work with in terms of what kind of interfaces work for people, because instead of just getting the data of like just the ones they know, the answer is like some touchless interfaces work better than others. And now we have that data, we know that, which previously we just weren't getting any behavior change responses from people. So it's made our lives easier in a sense. We have more data on user interaction, although the way we obtain it has to be remotely. So that's a challenge as well.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Ian in a second. I saw he had his hand up, but there's a quick follow-up question from James. How do you prevent or encourage the user to not actually touch the screen?
Yeah, it's a very good question. That's one of the challenges. So one of the things that we're considering is, in devices which have an existing touchscreen, it's actually easier for us to allow it to accept both touch and, well, it's equally easy for it to accept both touch and touchless, or just touchless. So from a user experience point of view, it's better that it does also accept touch input, because it prevents the user from repeatedly touching it. One thing I learned from my behavior change zoo background that I mentioned is that people don't read interpretation, by which I mean signage. In a zoo, for example, I think 15% of people actually read the signage. So it kind of doesn't matter how you signal it. People will make mistakes initially, basically. It will have to be signed, and a lot of people will not realize straight away. But hopefully, if they keep returning to the same kiosk, and especially as it becomes more ubiquitous, I think we're going to see people understanding it and expecting it.
Thank you. Ian, did you still have a question or a point? Oh, you're still muted. Sorry, just unmute yourself. Okay.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, it's just some reflections on what's been said so far, and the question to some extent. In terms of data, I know that both in terms of our company and also speaking as an individual, you know, from time to time we get phone calls from people who are collecting data. Some of the time it's a load of rubbish. You know, they're simply trying to scam. You know, they're collecting data so that they can then try and sell us something or demand something from us, which is always a challenge. But it does strike me that some people are much more open to giving data than others. So when anybody in my company is rung up, they will quickly put the phone down. We've only got 14 people. I'm the only salesman. So I'm one of the few, well, I am the only person who will bother to answer the phone. Even though I know we're not going to be selling anything to the government, I'm always prepared to give the government or one of the agencies that they've appointed to collect data, the data, because ultimately I hope that it might lead to us getting better deals from the government or from local authorities or from other agencies. So I think there are times when people are willing to give the data, or either because that's just they like talking about themselves, or because if there's an understandable sense that there's some value in giving the data, that they may well be prepared to do it. In terms of Antonia's comments earlier on, I was interested. I work for a company that we're called Ashdown Audio Visual, as you can see. We install touch screens in schools right across the whole of the southeast. I'd like to install more. We tragically didn't get the business to do it for the University of Brighton, even though we're the maintenance provider for them, partly because the procurement process for universities is so difficult for small businesses. However, Brighton University has got about 300 touchscreens. They're all made by Sharp. We supply Sharp, we supply Smart, we supply Clever Touch, we supply Promethean. They've all got different bits of technology. One of the great things about those, Antonia, is that they've moved the way in which kids engage with in their teaching environment. So when teachers were using blackboards with a bit of chalk, the only reason they'd ever involve the kids is if they needed to throw the chalk or throw the cleaner at the kids to get them to pay attention. And then when projection units were on whiteboards were used, again, it was the teacher's environment. One of the fantastic things about the touchscreens in schools is that they're actually a way, and not all teachers understand this, but it is a way of saying to the teacher, look, you go and engage with the kids that need your time and your energy, and use the screens to engage the kids who are prepared to stand up and start playing games and playing with the technology. So obviously there's a challenge now, just as you're facing a challenge, Antonia, then there is a challenge for many of the teachers in many of the schools. And in some senses, linking your approach to some of the teachers, to some of the schools, seems to me to be one opportunity to help you to understand the technology that they're using, and for them to understand some of the solutions that you're coming up with.
Thank you, Ian.
And then
conscious of time, I've got three more.
I'm sorry.
This question. I'll come back to you later. Thank you. First, Sam has a point to make. Then Paul. Then Steve.
I'll unmute myself. So what I wanted to talk about was picking up what Antonia was saying in terms of behaviour change. It is clear from successful models of behaviour change that you can't just give people information and tell them to not smoke or to wash their hands after the 5 points of the day that they need to. Some of the work that, working both with UNICEF and the World Bank, that Unilever has done historically with Lifebuoy, particularly in rural India, is telling that you need to give people information, motivation, and the behavioural skills to change their behaviour. If it is clear that if you don't wash your hands before you eat, particularly if you're in a culture that eats with its hands, and you don't wash your hands after you've been to the loo, then if you say there are these things called microbes, and Antonio, you were talking about kind of fecal particles on touchscreens and we may all be aware of if you leave a bowl of peanuts on a bar table in a bar, then by the end of the night there'll be 22 different traces of different types of urea in that bowl of peanuts. But microbes, to a pre-literate part of society, microbes are invisible. So how do you give people, you say you need to wash your hands because there are these things called germs. Okay, how do you persuade parents of rapidly urbanizing Indian kids that they need to teach their kids? Well, one thing you might say, and one thing that has been said, is what you do is you give them the motivation that if your kids stay well, they're more likely to do well at school, they're more likely to take on the aspirations of the next generations. That's okay, that's useful motivation, but you need to give people behavioral skills. And so how do you do that? Well, you create dust, ultraviolet dust that you can't see, and you get kids' hands dirty, and then you shine an ultraviolet light over the top, and then you see that actually when you wash your hands, you can get rid of these microbes that lead to illness, that lead to time off school, that lead to underperformance. So we absolutely do need to give people information, but not just kind of propaganda information. We need to give people information, the motivation. Well, I think one of the reasons why people are changing behavior so rapidly is there is a very personal, intrinsic, me, my family, potential illness, potential fatal illness here. There is strong motivation, but we also need to give people behavioral skills, which I think is one of the reasons why some mixed messaging or some confused messaging that's been given out is difficult for people to interpret, and people saying, oh, I don't understand, it's too hard to understand. Information, motivation, behavioral skills. I think it's very important that those 3 points are made in any public education campaign.
Thank you, Sam. Steve, I'll bring you in now.
Hi. Actually, Sam covered most of the points that I was going to raise, because I think the real interesting thing about behavior change is that way in which you create the triggers. So the most interesting thing for me about all this is that I guess with your touch screen, the trigger is going to be, well, I'm at the screen and now I want to buy something, so I've got to get it right. But the hand washing, the whole point that I felt was really impressive about the way they did it was they linked it to a specific event. So like, I've just come in, I need to wash my hands. And that worked quite well for most people because it was a trigger. The really interesting thing for me about other environmental stuff is I've been quite involved in it in lots of areas to do with food waste and things like that, is we're wasting way less food now, but we don't understand we actually are doing it. So the bigger challenge in all this is, how do we figure out, with all the data we've got, because we know we're wasting 34% less food than we were in spite of all the panic buying, according to RAP, what those habits are that we'd like people to retain. And we've got lots of data, but how do we use it to find out what the habits are?
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, on the data sharing kind of question, certainly we've seen in the public sector suddenly a lot of data sharing going on, which was hitherto sort of problematic for people. So there's nothing like a sense of shared urgency and endeavour to get through some of the data sharing anxieties. But I suppose looking forward, what's really interesting to us at the moment is how we can start to provide these kind of platform plays in a way where where citizens will continue to trust the council as a democratically accountable and trustworthy organisation. So one project I'm thinking of is citizen Wi-Fi, which we're funded to implement in Worthing and in Ada, and we're just about to do a design piece on how we might deliver citizen Wi-Fi quite ubiquitously, but in a way which maintains trust. So we're going to have to get, if you like, the contract between the citizen and the local authority right, so that we can start to understand how people are moving around the town and start to promote, including behaviour change messages to a wide number of people who are registered and trust citizen Wi-Fi as their sort of connectivity of choice. There's a lot of people who still don't want to use their data on their mobiles and stuff, and we think we can design something which will enable us to create a digital connection with our citizenry to do things like promote flu vaccinations in the winter and all sorts of other public health messages. But we can only do that if there's trust and there's a really transparent way of how people's data is collected and used.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll maybe draw on that a little bit more in the next question we'll look at, which is, what are we learning from this? But there's a follow-up question to Sam from Caroline, which is about the availability of data in terms of having time enough to plan for organisations. So, you know, what's the lead-in time that you feel organisations need in terms of their data storytelling and planning in order to be able to do it effectively? Because what we're seeing at the moment is a lot on the hoof.
There is a lot on the hoof, absolutely. And is the data available timely enough for some organisations to plan effectively? Absolutely not. But I think that one thing that this is teaching us is that good enough is good enough. It's an old saying about that any data processors, data storytellers will say that you know what often happens in not only data storytelling but in the use of analytics to power decision making is that there's a quote from an article in the Harvard Business Review at the beginning of last year that talks about the last mile problem, that efforts fall short in the last mile when it comes time to turn stuff into decisions and actions for others to take. Well, if we spend so much time polishing and perfecting and removing every outlier from our data, then there's absolutely no chance at all. Now that does mean that some outliers that are genuinely useful and are genuinely indicative of something strange, I don't mean like something strange like coronavirus appearing, but they're showing us something interesting, they may be missed. But I think that in order to be agile enough to take advantage of data, we're going to need to be not slapdash, but we're going to need to be much quicker, much more nimble, much more agile in our decision making based on data.
Thank you, Caroline. Hopefully that answers your question. I'd like to move the whole debate onto this question of learning, particularly what we're now learning, whether it's about security, whether it's about collaboration, whether it's about speed, whether it's about challenging assumptions. What is that likely to change in terms of a future attitude towards the role of data in innovation, particularly? And I wondered if there was anybody that wanted to lead, perhaps somebody who hasn't spoken before, that may have a view on, or even if you're not sure what it will change, something you'd like it to change. Maybe you've seen the promise of a new way of working. Is there anybody that would like to pick up on that perhaps hasn't spoken already? Judith, I'd like to bring you in.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm a lecturer at the University of Brighton, and as you know, we're lecturing remotely at the moment. One of the things that I have found really positive in this process, I mean, aside from, not to put it too lightly, our students being traumatized by the situation, is the fact that, as a 0.5 lecturer who has 3 other jobs, that being able to work remotely is very helpful to me. It's much less stressful. I found that once I've got over the brow of the hill relating to just connecting with the students and figuring out that they're okay, and then settling into this period, it's been much more useful, and I think I've been much more productive in the process. It's much more planned. Obviously, it is a bit like herding worms at the beginning, but I think that I have talked about the fact that I think that we should have mixed lectures in future. Tutorials don't have to be everyone in the room. Big lectures, I think, are really important, but other parts of the teaching process, lecturing process, can change. It can incorporate some of the remote aspects of this. I think that people are they're suspicious of it, partly because there's a whole room hustle that happens in terms of allocating rooms at the university space. But in terms of me as an outsider, as a visiting lecturer in some parts and as a lecturer in other parts, it really does work. So what I'm hoping for is that there will be a combined change, so that we've got some in person and some remote working in future.
And do you think that it would change the way that you may kind of assess, or obviously there's the teaching aspect of it in terms of imparting information and checking that learning is happening in a kind of formative way, but in terms of the assessment and the summative checking of learning at the end of a period of time, maybe you haven't had long enough to be able to test that yet, but do you think that there'll be a more blended way for doing that in education, a more comfortable way of doing that in education across the board as a result of this, or do you think?
Well, I teach in digital media, and some of the work is interactive. Some of the students are making animations, they're making work which is involves all sorts of innovation from their own perspective. So what it does rely on often is heavy duty professional kit. That's what they're missing at the moment. For our level 6s who are graduating anytime in the next 3 weeks effectively, we've had to change our consideration of their output because they just haven't had the kit. For level 5s who are not quite at that point, the second years, if you like, in terms of the way that I've approached it, because most of the heavy duty lecturing was done before we went into lockdown, and some of it has been done remotely with people who are working with Unity. We've delivered those kinds of workshops remotely. I would say if this were to continue, we would have to ensure that students had the kit. If they didn't have the kit that they needed in order to do the work, we would have to change the nature of the output that we would expect from them. Students who would normally have professional camera kit are using their phones. My thinking is that if you can make what you want to make and you can use your phone, when you finally do get your kit, it's going to be amazing, But unfortunately for them, they're graduating. So it's 6 of one, half of the other. Yes and no, I would say. And we are making allowances for some students, quite a lot of students generally speaking, but some in particular, who've not been able to access big programs like Cinema 4D. It takes up a lot of space on your computer, all of that stuff. Computers keep crashing. They're working on their own machinery, whereas under normal circumstances they'd be working on machinery in the university, etc. So one big change has happened, but generally speaking, for the second years, the ones that are not graduating, it's fine, certainly, but for the third years who are graduating, we've had to make adjustments.
There's something about the way that learning and access to knowledge and learning resources and so on, I've certainly seen change quite a lot over the last 6. This stuff's always been there, but it seems to have been made available to a very sort of targeted group of people. What I've noticed is that lots of organisations have re-put their resources online, but made lots of efforts to make them more accessible or to curate them slightly differently. And then you've got people signposting to each other's, lots of how-to guides, you know, for remote working, and lots of ways of using technology. And there feels to be a kind of mass sharing of knowledge in a different way over the last few weeks than perhaps what we've had before. It's not just for students, it's for everybody. Now, it's only a little bit, and it was because of necessity, but I wonder if that might stick around a little bit longer.
I'm not entirely sure whether it will. I think it's been very useful. I mean, certainly in terms of students writing essays and etc., referencing books and access to online resources has been more necessary, if you like, than under normal circumstances. As a lecturer who has a research element to my post, definitely been very helpful, because I can at least start the process, whereas normally I potentially would have had to wait until the end of term, etc. But you know, there is another element to it, which is this setup itself. You know, this would have probably been in person and probably been in a space you know, that I probably wouldn't have been able to get to because I'd have been lecturing, and that has happened quite a lot. And so, you know, there's an element of accessibility and kind of evening to a certain extent. Obviously, it depends on Wi-Fi, the playing field, which I think is, you know, something to be incorporated somehow in the process. That notion of accessibility and making things fair and equitable to a certain extent.
Yeah, thank you. We've probably got time for 2 or 3 more questions. Paul, did you have your hand up before? I'm not. It may have been raised from before. I think there's Ushi and Meg's got a question as well, so I want to make sure we've got time for all of those. Paul, did you have your hand up?
I did, and I'll just sort of support certainly Judith's point about remote working and how it will blend into the future. I think is massive. Certainly, we're thinking about that. We've successfully put teams working from home, and we want to really think about retaining that before people come back. And to the point Sam made, I think about the sense of dynamicness in data. I think if one thing's to be learnt, it's how we need to appreciate data as being hugely dynamic and hugely nuanced. So the traditions of sort of looking at reference data that's a bit old in so many cases is not how operational decisions should be made. It's trying to find how to get, or for an organization at least, how to get very real-time data being fed in, and to not be too focused on what is currently being measured, but to really think about what isn't being measured that we're missing. And in that sense, it's a constant sense of open inquiry. So we tried to just sort of identify people that needed help, rather than go to our databases and say who looks like they might be vulnerable. We didn't really do that. We just went out and tried to find them, because it's so dynamic. And I think we could have wasted a lot of time if we tried to sort of examine our understanding of vulnerability from the data we already held, rather than just go out and find a snapshot of what's happening today. So that dynamism, I think, is really, really key. And of course, as we look at things like the modal shift in transport, I think, you know, being alive to new ways that people will move themselves around places, and what we want to encourage and what we want to shine a light on to discourage. It's the dynamism of data, I think, which Sam points to, which is really important.
Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good point. Ushi.
I think some really compelling, clear visual data that might be hitting home is about air pollution levels. And I'd hope that maybe people that hadn't thought about environment so much could see more clearly the effect that lockdown has had. And although the whole lockdown can't continue forever, hopefully businesses and organisations will have the evidence to trust that people can work from home, so they don't need them in the office keeping tabs on them. Hopefully more people can work from home and less people travel. Yeah, that was awesome.
No, really good point. And I think that tangibility, that visibility, you know, you look out your window and you see the change, and then you look at the data that's presented and that's very clear. You know, direct correlation, less traffic means less air pollution, but also there's the medical data starting to come through suggesting that areas with high air pollution are where people are struggling with the disease more, you know, in actual terms of mortality rates are higher. So put those three things together and it feels like a fairly compelling argument that more people might understand. Meg, you had a question. Is she there? Is she gone? Oh, she's disappeared. Well, I'm going to ask her question anyway. Oh, she had to go. Do talk about question one. Yes. Okay. Do you think organisations might see the benefit of more sharing, but then try to monetize it? That's a really good question. I think that's probably the last one that we'll look at. But obviously, we've heard there Paul putting across the case for why the public sector can use data better to support vulnerable communities. But will this be exploited, and is that okay? So any views on that for the final few minutes? No one's willing to put your head above the parapet with that one.
I wonder whether there's something about kind of releasing data that points to the right kinds of social and environmental change that we're after. And if we want people to innovate on integrated transport and walking and cycling, for example, then push that data out rather than make it easier for, I don't know, for there to be more cars on the road in whatever way. So to be kind of intentional about what data is released and why, to support good goals. I think if that stuff's monetized, then great, because that's where innovation comes from. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think if the data is very clear about what genuinely in our communities we need and we want, it stops people being sold things that they definitely don't need or want as well. So there are more incentives for people to change products and services they're offering so that they are genuinely useful. I heard a phrase the other day, which I've been using quite a lot, but I really like, is that this isn't going to be about survival of the fittest. This is going to be about survival of the most useful. And I think there's a kind of, that seems to be shining quite a lot across sector, I think, in terms of how we think about our role in this, whether we are, you know, civic leaders or businesses or artists, as well as public servants. And I wonder if that will change the paradigm shift slightly. Okay, unless anyone's got another kind of burning point or comment to make, we will be back in a few weeks. So this was a little sort of test to see what the appetite was for having conversations about something that we are still very much in the thick of. We haven't got the benefit of hindsight or rational analysis looking at history. We are in the middle of this, so we're talking about things that we don't all fully understand, but I think there's something quite exciting about that and dynamic. As Paul said, you know, we're hearing from people who are creating these things right now. So we want to explore that a little bit further with the DRIVA Arts DRIVA kind of wide angle and focus workshops. So we were going to have a 2-day summit at the end of March. We couldn't do that, so you know, whether or not we'll be able to have another kind of physical 2-day meeting towards the end of the year, I don't know, but we are hoping to have a series of online slightly more sort of in-depth and focused workshops and talks all around different aspects of things we've covered today, but in more depth. So what I invite you to do is to reflect on the things that you've talked about today or heard about that have really interested you, and drop me a line so that I know that those things are the threads that we might be able to explore in more detail. Or if there's things that we haven't talked about and you think we should, I'd like to hear about that as well. But we'll be focusing on the role of data in this current disruption and what that's doing for innovation, for behaviour change, for creativity. And we'll have more details about when and where those events are soon, hopefully sort of end of June, beginning of July. But yes, do let me know what you'd like to see in them. And hopefully we'll see you all back again then. Do visit the driva.com website, lots of information and resources on there, and ways in which you can connect with one another. I see Antonia's put her details in the chat bar. Anyone else wants to kind of be linked in with anyone, obviously feel free to add your details. But I want to say another huge thank you to our 3 provocateurs today, to Sam, so give Sam a big silent clap because you're all muted, to Antonia, and to Paul. Thank you very much, and we'll make the recording available so you can revisit at your own pace, and we'll pick this all up again very soon. So thanks all.